Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I'm sharing some Magical Fushcia cards using the new Magical Fushcia collection from Spellbinders. We have the Magical Fushcia die set as well as the Magical Fushcia press plate and die set that has a few sentiments with it. Then there is also a layering stencil. The layering stencil coordinates with that press plate. It can be used on its own or it can be used with the Magical Fushcia embossing folder. So there's so many different ways you can combine these together. The press plate you can foil, or you could use it in the Better Press system, and then you can use the stencil to color it. You could also watercolor it if you wanted use it on watercolor cardstock. Now I started this video using the Glimmer system to hot foil with Aura foil on Hammermill Cardstock. I messed up the taping in a few different places in this video, so I didn't get the peel off of the foil with this fuchsia, but look how beautiful that is. There's a little bit of over foiling, so I'll show you how I clean that up really easily, but it creates such a gorgeous image. I'm also hot foiling the sentiments with that Aura foil so that we have some coordinating sentiments to go with it. I also use this plate in the Better Press system to heat emboss the image. So there's several different ways you can use it. You could also use that die that's in that set to cut out the image if you want to add it as a separate layer on top of your cards. I don't actually use it to cut out the die because I just really like the image as it is, but that's definitely an option if you wanted to have it as a cut out piece. And I love the fact that there's a die included for that. Now, as well as regular foiling, I am doing the solid hot foiling of these pieces. For these cards, I don't use the solid hot foiled pieces. I always love having the regular foiled and solid hot foiled images. It's much easier to store that foil while it's right on that cardstock. My machine is already hot anyways. Sometimes I will use those pieces as is. Not often because they're a little bit too flashy for my liking most of the time. Most of the time I will use them as mats around my cards. And then sometimes I use those cardstock pieces as specialty cardstock and use them to die cut different pieces. Now you could use that solid hot foil to die cut the little stamen pieces for the die cut for the flowers. I ended up using some Beeswax Cardstock, but if you wanted it to be a little bit more flashy, that is another option. Now to simply clean up my images, I'm using a piece of Best Ever Craft tape. This is the thicker one. I put it on my shirt a couple times to remove some of the sticky, and then I simply put that tape over my foiled image and it takes away any excess foil. Now it's really hard to see on video, but when you look at the back of the tape, you can see all of the foil that it was removed, and it definitely cleans up the images and crisps them up nicely. Now there are coordinating dies to go with those sentiments, so I'm going to die cut those pieces out. I always love when sentiments have dies to go with them. It just makes them look nice and neat. I'm using some Best Ever Craft tape to tape those dies in place. I want to make sure they're not going to move on me as I'm doing my die cutting. Now I put my sentiments just a touch too close, so I'm doing the two outer ones first, and I will do the inner one as a separate die cut, because if I were to put that die on there right now, I would have two dies overlapping and would end up ruining my dies. We definitely don't want to be doing that. So I'm going to die cut these first two, and then off screen I'll die cut the last one so that we have our sentiments ready to go for our cards. Look at how nice and neat those are. Now, after having our sentiments completed, we can use the layering stencils to color in our images. You don't have to use the layering stencils, but it definitely makes it really easy, especially if you're wanting to use some ink pads. For this image, I'm just using some distress ink pads because we have that beautiful shimmer from the foil. I didn't feel it needed anything else other than the distress pads. So for the first layer, I'm using some Kitsch Flamingo. Now, when I'm doing my ink blending, I like to make sure there's one area that's darker and one area that's lighter. So the areas that are darker on these pieces are the areas of the petals that go behind another layer of petals. I think it just looks a lot more visually interesting when we have lighter areas with our ink and darker areas with the ink. But if you prefer, you could do a solid color. It's just my personal preference. For the next layer of petals, I'm using a combination of shaded lilac with some wilted violet. So I'm going to start with the shaded lilac, and then I'm going to go in with the wilted violet and just darken some of the areas of those petals. I'm using large Spellbinders blending brushes here. These are really good for backgrounds. They're a little bit large for these stencils, so you could use a smaller brush for sure, but they get the job done, and I have them handy for me. And I really love how they feel in my hand when I'm doing the ink blending with them. For the next layer, the last layer of petals here, I'm going to be using some Kitsch or some picked raspberry. I want the nice bright pink color to it. I started off with the Kitsch Flamingo, and it ended up being a little bit lighter than I wanted it to be. So I go in with that picked raspberry and just darken those colors up. So I have different colors or different tones of pink here. Now, if you do a Google search and look up fuchsias, there's many different color combinations. For this first card, I went with more traditional colors to it, but you could definitely get really creative with those colors and do something that's completely non-traditional, or even just get really creative with them. The last two layers of the stencils are leaves and stems, and the last layer also has the stamens for the flowers. So I'm going to do the leaves and the stems with the bundled sage, making sure that the ink is heavier where that leaf or where that stem goes behind a flower or behind some petals. And once again, making it lighter towards the outside of the leaves and darker towards where or the base of them or where it goes beneath something. And as I said a moment ago, the last stencil has leaves on it, but it also has the stamens for the flowers. So I want to make sure that I don't accidentally get green on those stamens. I want to keep the colors what they're supposed to be or what I intend for them to be. So I do the bundled sage for the leaves that are on this. You can see I just grabbed a piece of scrap paper to cover the area of the stencil that I didn't want to have that green. For the stamens of the flowers, I'm using, or the little things in the center, I'm assuming they're stamens, I'm using the Lisa Horton Gold ink pad to add that beautiful color to it. So now that we have our image done here, I'm just going to trim it down, and I'm going to do a very, very simple layer for my card. Now you could, at this point, if you wanted, you could put it in the embossing folder and emboss that detail. I opted to keep it flat. So this is where I started making errors in my recording. I forgot to record the assembly. I took the image and I trimmed it down to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. I die cut a piece or trimmed down a piece of Hammermill Cardstock to 4 inches by 5 inches, and then just used the Wilted Violet Distress ink to create that mat around it, and then just layered those together. I already had that sentiment right on there, so I didn't need to add a sentiment to it. And I also missed creating my next image. With the next image, I used that same press plate, but in the Better Press system, I used it with some Versamark ink and heat embossed that image with black embossing powder. This way we have the nice raised edges to the image, and I just like the look of it. You could also just use the regular Better Press ink if you just wanted black outline but didn't want to have that glossy outline to it that you get from heat embossing it. I'm going to layer the stencils the same way as I did for the last layer or the last card. But what I'm going to do is add some interference ink so that we have a little bit of extra shimmer to it. The first layer of the stencils, I just used some picked raspberry distress ink. I didn't use the lighter Kitsch Flamingo. I'm making the petals for this one darker because we have that darker outline. For the second layer, I'm just using that Wilted Violet, and then I'm going in with some Lavender Fields interference ink to add that extra bit of shimmer. Now, interference inks have two properties to them. They have one look on white or light cardstock and a completely different look on black or dark cardstock. Because we're going over inks, we're going to have the color that are there from the light cardstock, then we're going to have that extra bit of shimmer to it. So it's just going to add some interesting shimmer to the image when you tilt it into the light, and I just love the look of it. So the first one was Lavender Fields. That one is purple with a green interference color to it. This is Pink Champagne. I'm using this over the next layer, which had some picked raspberry distress ink and then the Pink Champagne interference ink, and that also has a green interference property to it. So when we tilt these into the light, we're going to see a little bit of that green shimmer on those petals. For the leaves, I'm going to be using Bundled Sage Distress ink again, and then I'm going to go in with some Summer Garden interference ink. So Summer Garden interference ink has a blue interference property to it. So we're going to see that green ink color, but when we tilt it into the light, we're going to see some of that blue shimmer, and it just takes the image to the next level, in my opinion. I really love the combination of distress inks with some interference inks on top of there. Now you do want to do the distress ink first, and then you can do the interference ink without cleaning your stencil. You don't want to do the interference ink first and then do the distress ink without cleaning your stencil, because if you pick up some of that ink with the interference in it, you're going to contaminate your distress pads, so you want to keep them nice and clean. So I always do distress first, then do my interference, and then I take the stencil off and clean it, and it just washes off under a runny tap. We don't need any special cleaner. For the last layer, once again, I use that Bundled Sage with the Summer Garden for the leaves, and then I'm using that gold pad for the stamen on the flowers to give them some nice metallic shine as well. So our image is done, and when I bring this mat to the camera, you can see the shimmer that you get from those interference inks. Now, when I did those interference inks, I only did them towards the base of the petals. I didn't do it for the whole petal because I wanted to have some areas with and some areas without. I thought it would look a little bit more interesting like that. And same with my leaves. I only did the interference ink on the base of the leaves and on the stems so that there's some areas that have that shimmer and some areas that don't. Again, making it look a little bit more visually interesting. I cut my layers for this card the same as I did the last card. I'm using a black piece of cardstock for my mat. So I trim that down to 4 inches by 5.5 or 5.25 inches. And then my image piece, I trim that down to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. Now, when I was assembling this, or when I had this in my mind, I thought I would like to put some of the Magical Fuchsia die cuts on top of this. So you'll see them on the top left of my screen. As I was assembling them, first of all, the colors were a little bit off from what I had ink blended. And then when I laid them on top, there was just too much going on. It was just too much clutter. So I opted not to do that. So I'll use those die cuts in one of my other cards. But you could, if you wanted, if you did this background a little bit more subtle, say a more subtle color for the outline as well as a more subtle color for your ink blending, you could probably put those die cuts on top of it. What I'm going to end up doing is putting them on an embossed background that is very lightly ink blended. That is not going to be this particular card. It's coming after this one. For this one, I took a piece of Hammermill Cardstock and I used the embossing folder and embossed that image. Then I'm going to be using the layering stencils with my sticky mat in order to color all of those embossed pieces. Now, I typically like to do my stenciling before embossing because I just prefer to do my stenciling on a flat piece of cardstock. I do find though that, especially if you're using a certain image, that often when you're embossing it, sometimes that paper kind of shifts a little bit in the embossing folder and it's not quite as perfect once you've embossed it. So for this one, I wanted the images to be perfect. So I embossed it first and I'm going to stencil it later. It does make the stencil layers a little bit more challenging to layer up, just to see those areas with the white on white with the texture, just to see the outline of the image is a little bit more challenging. It is possible, but just be a little bit more patient with yourself. I'm using this sticky mat to hold my piece of cardstock down, but you'll see I'm using some Best Ever Craft tape to hold my stencil down just because there's not a large area of the stencil sticking to that sticky mat. So I want to make sure it's not going to shift on me. So for the first layer with the layering stencil, I use the Kitsch Flamingo Distress ink for those petals. For the second layer here, I'm using the Wilted Violet and then going in with the Lavender Fields Interference ink, making sure to concentrate that ink towards the base of the petals where I also have a darker concentration of the distress ink. For the next layer, we're going to layer the third stencil on there. And you can see that I do take a little bit of extra time when layering the stencils just to make sure that everything is lined up perfectly. I'm going to start off with the Kitsch Flamingo Distress ink, making sure that ink is darker towards the base of the petal. Then go in with the Picked Raspberry, just darkening that color. And really, you could eliminate the Kitsch Flamingo here because I pretty much go over top of it with that Picked Raspberry. Next, I'm going to use the Pink Champagne on the base of those petals just to add that little bit of shimmer to them. And yes, I have different brushes for each one of my interference pads. This is what works for me. I have a little label on them telling me what brush it is. That way I don't have to clean it up for a different color. I just have one labeled for each one of the pads. And like I said, this is what works for me. It's not for everyone. You could rinse your brushes off and just have a set of brushes for interference inks and just clean them off every time. But I like to not have to clean them up and just do it. This works. So for my leaves, once again, I'm going to go in with that bundled stage, making sure that that ink is darker where the leaf goes behind a petal or behind a leaf. And then I'm going to go in with that Summer Garden Interference ink, just adding that little bit of shimmer where the ink is darkest. And then finally, we have one more layer here for the last little bit of petals as well as those stamens. So we're going to layer those together, match everything up, tape the stencil in place to make sure it's not going to move on me. And I'm going to repeat the process with the leaves where I use the bundled sage and then a little bit of the Summer Garden Interference. Now, because we have two different layers of leaves here, I'll typically be lighter with one area or with one layer and then a little bit darker with another layer so it looks like different tones. and I'm going to go in with that Summer Garden right after that. And then once again, using the gold for the stamen on the flowers. I just really like the look of the gold. If you look at in fuchsia images on the internet, they're actually pink, but I just really liked the look of the gold on them, especially after seeing the foiled images. I thought it was just really pretty. So we have our piece here finished. Now you could, if you wanted, you could have die cut this piece first, then embossed it, and then done your inking, and then you would have an embossed piece. You wouldn't want to die cut it now because it would flatten all of that embossed texture to it, but that is another option of how to use this trio of sets here. So I have my embossed piece there. I trimmed that down to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. My other piece here is Hammermill Cardstock trimmed down to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. And I used that Lisa Horton gold pad to ink around the outside edges. You could use gold cardstock if you wanted as well. This is a lot more inexpensive, and it's just an easy way to create a gold mat. Because we're already using that gold ink on our stenciled image, it coordinates perfectly with the gold in our image. Glue this to an A2 card base, and then I'm gluing the embossed piece. For all of my cards, I'm gluing everything with some Barely Art glue. I have it in a fine line bottle, so it works for gluing my cards together like this, and it also works really well when I go to glue my fuchsia die cuts together. So I added the sentiment in the middle here, and then looked for a minute, and I just didn't like it. So I changed it and put it up by the stems towards the top. Another option here would be to use some ink and ink blend that sentiment, so it was a little bit more visible on camera. It is visible in real life, but on camera it just kind of looks like it's faded out a little bit. And it definitely looks better towards the top of the card than covering some of those fuchsia flowers on the middle of the card. So for my last 2 cards, I'm going to be using the Magical Fushcia die, and I'm going to do them in 2 different color palettes. So this one here is a little bit more of the traditional fuchsia colors. The pink pieces are cut out of Dahlia Cardstock. The purple pieces are cut out of Violet Cardstock. The leaves there are die cut out of Rainforest as well as Fern Cardstock, and then the stamen are cut out of Gold Cardstock, or sorry, Beeswax Cardstock. I did ink them with that Lisa Horton gold ink pad though. On the leaves, I used that Summer Garden Interference to add a little bit of that shimmer. You can see it a lot better on the colored cardstock than you could see when I was stenciling. On the pink pieces, I used the pink champagne, or on the Dahlia pieces, I used the pink champagne. And then on the violet pieces, I used the lavender fields. Now these pieces are really easy to layer together. What I do like to do though is I like to put them on my desk and just kind of put them in order of how they glue together. That way I have all the pieces there at hand. It just organizes things, makes it just a little bit easier and simpler to put them together. Now when I was first prepping for these cards, I just did 1 of each die cut. I wasn't really paying attention to how many I needed. The image on the front of the die package has 2 different flowers as well as the bud. So you do need to cut some of the pieces multiple times in order to have both of those flowers as well as the base piece for each one of the flowers plus the base piece for the bud. So just keep in mind that if you die cut them all or just 1 of each of the dies, you are going to need to pull out your die cuts or your dies and your die cutting machine in the middle of creating your cards and ink some more pieces, and that's what I'm doing here. So I did, for my last card, I did go back and cut more pieces. I knew, or I was better equipped to know exactly how many pieces I was going to need for each one of them. So those will all be die cut at once. But just know, if you die cut just 1 of each one of those die pieces that are in the set, you're going to need to stop and do it more if you want to have more than 1 flower and more than 1 bud. So the layer pieces are easy to layer together. I did this one in traditional colors. On the front of the package, they have a lot more different colors. They have a lot more shades. I chose to just do them in 2 colors and then the stamens in a different color. You could get really creative with it. You could even use just white cardstock with this and use your inks to color your pieces. So you can really have fun with this. I love layering pieces like this because all of those layers together give you so much more detail, and you can just really customize it to your liking and what you're going for. So I'm gluing everything together with that Barely Art glue. The reason why I like to use it is it goes a really long way, but it also gives you that wiggle room to move and shimmy everything in place to make sure that you have those pieces where you want them to go. So this is the card that I'm going to use the embossing folder for the background. I'm not going to use the layering stencil to color this background. I'm just going to use my brushes and just very simply add a little tiny bit of color. So it's going to be very, very subtle color in the background over top of that embossed background. You could even leave this not colored if you wanted, but I thought having some really subtle color there kind of tied the fuchsias in, but it didn't make it quite as busy as when I had it on top, or laying on top of the press plate background. That, in my opinion, it was just far too busy. This is just a little bit more subtle. You still get that texture in the background, but the die cut is the star of the show. I used a piece of the violet cardstock for my mat for this card, and I trimmed it down to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. My embossed piece here, I'm trimming it down to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. When it's cards like this that have just beautiful die cuts or beautiful press plate images, I typically keep the layout of my card fairly simple because I think they're the star of the show and I think they shine all on their own. But you could easily, if you wanted, use some shaped or nesting dies for this. However, I would use the nesting die for the centerpiece before embossing it. Die cut it first, then emboss it, and that way you don't lose any of the embossed texture when you if you die cut it afterwards. So once I have my layers together on my A2 card base, I can add my die cuts. I also chose one of the sentiments that I had foiled at the beginning. Another option here would be to use the Better Press system to heat emboss some sentiments or just ink some sentiments if you wanted them to be a certain color. That's an easy way to do it. So I'm going to glue down my stem first, and then I'm going to tuck in all of my leaves. You can see the inked, the very subtle inked texture from the embossing folder in the background, but it doesn't take any focus away from those die cuts in the front. Those are definitely the star, and they're definitely the focus. The embossed bit in the background, it just kind of supports it, just kind of ties it all in. So I die cut my leaves and stems out, or my leaves out of 2 different colors of green here for a little bit of extra interest. You could just use one color if you want. There is a few different sizes of the leaves, so I die cut it multiple times so that I have lots of leaves to go with. I want to make sure that I have enough. I always think a little bit more is better than not having enough. Another option is if you have extra leaves, I just put them in a Ziploc bag and store them with my die set, so that next time I'm working with that die set, I may already have some pieces die cut that are ready to go for that project that I'm creating. I add a little bit of stickles on the stamen just for a little bit of extra texture as well as a little bit of sparkle. So these are the die cuts for my last card here. You can see that they're a completely different color palette. So the light pink there is Chiffon Cardstock, and then the purple is Orchid Cardstock. For these ones, I'm using some worn lipstick distressing to ink blend on the Chiffon Cardstock. Then I'm going to be using some seedless preserves on the Orchid Cardstock. Now for these ones, I'm not going to add any interference colors to them. I just thought a little bit more subtle was nicer here, so I opted to keep them very, very simple and not add any of that shimmer to it. The interference colors tend to be really, really bright and really vibrant. So because these colors are a lot more subtle, I thought it would take away from that rather than enhance it. So I have all of my pieces layered here together, ready to go in the order that they get put together, get assembled together. Again, this is how I find, this is the way that I think makes the most sense and is the most organized. So as I'm gluing everything together, I'm pulling it from the order that I have it laid out on my desk. By doing it this way, I know that I have all of my pieces ready. I have them here. I know that I'm not going to need to stop and die cut something because I forgot about it, as well as the fact that it just keeps my brain a little bit more organized while I am assembling. And it's much easier than having a pile of die cuts and then rummaging through it while you're assembling something, trying to look for a certain one. So by gluing these together with that liquid glue, it makes it really, really easy. I can use as much or as little glue as I want because I have that fine tip on there, and I can wiggle and move it in place as I'm assembling. It just makes the assembly process super easy. Once I have these stems of flowers, I will let them dry for just a few moments before I add them to my card. You could assemble them on your card as you're going, but sometimes I find that by assembling them ahead of time, when I put it on my card, I can just adjust it a little bit if I feel that it needs it. Often it doesn't necessarily need it, but I always like to have that option once I'm done, because the odd time I'll put it on the card how I had envisioned it in my head and it just doesn't look right. It needs to be changed, or it needs to be just adjusted in a little way. By doing it separately, that makes it nice and easy to do. For the background for this card, I'm going to use the molded frame embossing folder. This is just a very, very simple one, and I thought it would just be a nice background for these gorgeous fuchsia dies or fuchsia die cuts. I'm using Indigo Cardstock. I thought it would be a nice background, not quite as stark as black cardstock, but you certainly could use that. I had a piece of 4 1/4 by 5.5 inch cardstock that was embossed, and then I'm using my trimmer just to trim that down so that we have a little bit of white around the outside of my A2 card base. Now I left this piece as is. You could, if you wanted, ink that background just to highlight some of the details on that embossed background. I didn't want to take any attention away from those fuchsias, and I love the look of that color palette of the fuchsia on that Indigo cardstock. I think it's really, really pretty. I added one of my sentiments to that background, and then I'm going to glue those fuchsias on there. Now I just did a very simple stem here. If you wanted, you could do a double stem if you wanted to have more flowers. But once again, sometimes less is more. Sometimes it gets a little bit too cluttered if you add too much to it. And these flowers are gorgeous, so I don't think they need a whole lot to them. So once I have my fuchsias on that background there, I can tuck in the leaves where I feel that they're necessary. Typically when I have a die set that I haven't used, I'll kind of follow the layout on the front of the die package. And then once I've done it once, I will typically just change it up and alter it just a little bit, just to get a little bit creative with it. For these leaves, for this particular one, I used the Rainforest Cardstock again, but I used Peridot Cardstock because we had lighter flowers. I thought the Fern Cardstock would be a little bit too dark for them. So I kept the leaves a little bit lighter with this one. Once again, once it's completely done, I'm just adding a little bit of stickles to the stamen. I use Stardust stickles, so it doesn't have any color to it, but it just adds that sparkle and it just adds that little bit of texture to it. So here is the finished card. Super, super simple. On video, you don't see as much of that molded background as you do in real life, but it's just a really nice, simple base for it. You can find all of the products that I've used listed and linked down in the description box below. This is the first card with those fuchsia die cuts and a little bit more of a traditional color palette, but we have that embossed background adding texture and a little bit of subtle color in that background. Then we have our card that is just using the embossing folder as well as the layering stencils. Now you could also, if you wanted, use that press plate to get the outline for the images, but it's not necessary. And I love the fact that we have different products here that coordinate and mix and match with each other that you can customize to the look that you're going for. Then we have our card with the press plate that is heat embossed with that black embossing powder. It definitely gives a more bold, striking look. And then our very first one done with that beautiful Aura Glimmer foil. It's subtle, but it just adds that beautiful metallic shimmer to it. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate all the time that you spend with me. I hope you have a fantastic day.